From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Trump signs an executive order to set up a U.S. sovereign wealth fund, maybe even to buy TikTok. Meantime, the DOGE effort to streamline the government gets put on temporary pause and heads into the federal courts. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnists Alicia Finley and Kim Strassel. The flurry of executive actions from the White House continues, including one ordering the Treasury and Commerce departments to create a plan for establishing a sovereign wealth fund in the United States. Let's start with Donald Trump and then Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent in the Oval Office this week, explaining their idea.
We're going to have a sovereign wealth fund, which we've never had. We have a lot of things that create wealth, and you're seeing that over the last 2 weeks. I think we've created more wealth. Other people have created de-wealth. The people, my predecessors, we're creating a lot of wealth. So other countries have sovereign wealth funds, and they're much smaller countries, and they're not the United States. We have tremendous potential in this country, tremendous. You're seeing that, what's happened just in a short period of time. And as an example, TikTok, we're going to be doing something perhaps with TikTok, and perhaps not. If we make the right deal, we'll do it. Otherwise, we won't.
We're going to stand this thing up within the next 12 months. We're going to monetize the asset side of the U.S. balance sheet for the American people. We're going to put the assets to work. And I think it's going to be very exciting. We're going to study best practices that's done around the world. It'll be a combination of liquid assets that we have in this country as we work to bring them out for the American people.
Alicia, what do you make of this idea?
Well, I think it's a horrible idea. I think this is coming from Donald Trump, the deal maker, the real estate guy. I'm not sure he's really thought this through. Modern countries actually have sovereign wealth funds, and that's because the primary source of funding for these sovereign wealth funds usually are commodity sales or revenues from oil and gas, or in the case of China, foreign currency or foreign exchange reserves. And because we are running now close to a $2 trillion deficit, and we also have a trade deficit, we really don't have ending funding sources for this, or natural funding sources. Now, you've probably just heard Scott Bessent suggest, well, maybe there's some way to monetize the U.S. Treasury's balance sheet, which supposedly has $4.7 trillion in assets. Now, when we talk about assets, that's actually what most people would think about as debt. A lot of this is loans that the U.S. government has made, $1.6 trillion in student loans. There's also various loans for green energy, small businesses, disaster relief. Much of these loans are subsidized by the government and are actually probably going to be written off by 25% or more, at least in the case of the student loan. So these assets are what I would call phantom assets. The question is, what investor would actually want to buy these or stake in these? So the bigger problem with this idea, and we can get to this later, is it's just another vehicle for politicians to accomplish industrial policy to favor their particular businesses, favored businesses, just like the Biden administration has been doing with its some $400 billion Department of Energy's loan guarantee fund for green energy businesses. And so it really is just a way for politicians to throw some more money around without any kind of congressional oversight or accountability.
I would second Alicia's skepticism of this idea. My understanding is that the idea behind a sovereign wealth fund might make sense in, say, a small country where there's a bunch of oil that has just been discovered. They're getting a gusher of new revenue, and they don't want to spend it all in one place. So they set some of it aside, and instead of just putting it in the mattresses, the idea is to invest it someplace in a rainy day fund for future investment, future development. But that is not the case of the United States, which is running deficits year to year right now of close to $2 trillion. Kim, the bigger concern, I think, is what Alicia was going into at the end of her answer there, which is that this would turn into a point of leverage for the government over private companies if it is investing in private companies. Howard Lutnick, who is nominated to be Trump's Commerce Secretary, is saying this: if we are going to buy 2 billion COVID vaccines, maybe we should have some warrants and some equities in these companies that have growth for the health of the American people, unquote. But then just imagine what this administration or a future administration, the next administration, might do with that, all of the demands on pharma companies for price controls. Kim, it's hard to imagine the end of where that would go. I'm old enough, and I think you are, to remember the name Solyndra.
Let me just state that for the record, I'm all for blue sky thinking, and I've actually somewhat enjoyed this past week, Donald Trump saying, yeah, let's just take over Gaza, and the complete horror and shock that has engendered, mostly, although I think it designed to get people to think in a new way. This is just an unmitigated, very bad idea. And I was really struck by the opening clip, the promise we were going to go study best practices around the world. There are no best practices around the world. It's all bad everywhere. I mean, yes, there are certain sovereign wealth funds that are managed relatively better than others, but what they all show are the worst practices. And the fact that all of these, because they are politically created, end up becoming political objects. And so that takes a number of different shapes and forms. In some European countries that have these, we have seen that they become basically piggy banks for prominent politicians to loan money to cronies for their special business ventures. In some places, it's just straight up corruption. The sovereign wealth fund in Malaysia, we know, was just allowing this sort of lavish lifestyle for the prime minister there. We have sovereign wealth funds here in the United States. The state of Alaska has a giant one. And what that goes to prove, and by the way, it's a housing for the revenues that come in from Alaska's oil and gas industry. But even that shows that even when you have very tight rules around these things, for instance, that fund was created as a bargain that the people of Alaska gave up their own mineral rights. And in return, this fund is supposed to pay Alaskans a check every year. And there's a formula set out, which the state legislature in Alaska routinely ignores and cuts a check because they'd rather keep all the money and spend it on bigger government. So we don't have a lot of good practices. And the real risk, yes, Kyle, as you note, is that they use this to invest in companies, say the way France invests in Renault, and it allows them to then use politics to force private entities to make very poor decisions that aren't in the best interest of shareholders, that aren't in the best interest of the company's profitability or its employees. They're done for political purposes. And it's absolutely terrifying to think of the federal government having any stake or say, for instance, in the pharmaceutical industry's, strategic plans or management.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Alicia, one notable piece of this White House executive order is that it asks the Treasury Department and the Commerce Department to come up with a plan for establishing this sovereign wealth fund. And it says the plan shall include an evaluation of the legal considerations for establishing and managing such a fund, including any need for legislation, unquote. So, Alicia, how much doubt is there here about whether Trump would need Congress to get this thing set up? Because if he does, then I start to wonder whether there are going to be enough votes to get that over the finish line.
I think there's no doubt that he will require congressional authorization to set up this fund. It would supposedly be an exercise of the Congress's appropriation spending powers, because even if you were to somehow monetize the Treasury's assets, as we're noting earlier, student loans, that's still an exercise of legislative power. My concern is that you might actually be able to get Democrats and Republicans to go along with this idea. Recall under President Biden, White House kind of leaked that they were working on a sovereign wealth fund, too, to advance their own strategic priorities. And Congress members would love nothing more to spend more money without it and have it as a kind of a pseudo off-balance sheet vehicle to do so. And then they could lobby whoever the investment managers are in charge of this fund to invest in their favorite companies. That's actually what happens with the government pension funds in the states. And you also saw a lot of bipartisanship under Biden to set up the CHIPS Act, $280 billion of which was, again, showered around various companies. And so there's a lot of bipartisan appetite to spend and to steer money toward particular companies or industries that the politicians prefer.
We'll have to wait and see what this plan from the Treasury and the Commerce Department ultimately says. But if Trump tried to do this without any act of Congress, just by executive authority, I have little doubt that it would end up in the courts. And that, Kim, is where some of the Department of Government efficiency efforts this week are now heading. 2 orders by federal judges, one on this buyout offer to federal workers that has now been accepted reportedly by something like 60,000 federal employees. No ruling on the merits by the judge in that case. He's just saying, we're going to put this on hold. On Monday, he's going to have a hearing where they can go through the merits of the legal challenges to whether that is within the executive branch's power or not. Also, a order by a federal judge putting limits on sharing of Treasury Department payment system information with outsiders, as well as a couple of special government employees who are now at the Treasury Department but are affiliated with this Elon Musk Doge effort. Kim, I have not looked closely enough at either of those legal issues to have a view on whether the Doge efforts are within the law here. But a couple of points come to mind. One is that this is how the legal system works. There has been some panic in Washington this week every time that Elon Musk glances in the direction of another agency or federal bureau. People get upset. But this is the legal system at work. And 2, it has always been true, but it underlines the fact that for this Doge effort to make a real difference and to have a lasting, sticking effect, these efforts need to be within the executive authority of the president and whatever authority he is then delegating to these cabinet officials and the Doge people working inside of them.
Yeah, this is the legal system at work, whether or not that legal system was ever needed. And that would be my guess, my broad point about this. Memories are short, but if you go back to the beginning of the first Donald Trump term, we saw the exact same thing happening. I ended up writing about it in this book I wrote called Resistance, which was about the resistance to Donald Trump. Just a flood of lawsuits. Any single action he took, he was hit by 3 or 4 lawsuits all around. And while those lawsuits got a lot of attention when they were coming out, the newspapers couldn't get enough of them. And supposedly it was all evidence that we had an autocratic president who was breaking all the laws and bringing us to constitutional crisis. What didn't get reported as much is that pretty much every one of them failed. I mean, I think there was a 95% strikeout rate, because this is what people forget, is that Donald Trump might be out there, look like a bull in a china shop at times, but by and large, the vast majority of all the people who are around them are constitutional conservatives who actually do care a great deal about the law. And I've asked some former members of the Trump administration, people who have worked in both the administrative law and in the legal sector, about what they think about some of these moves. And by and large, what almost all of them have said to me is that while some of this is highly unconventional, it is not by any measure illegal if you really look into it. Now, if you get a creative enough attorney, you get a creative enough judge, there might be some way that this does end up becoming a bar or a block or an impediment for a period of time as to their plans going forward. But I would wager when we step back 6 or 8 months from now, that a lot of these initial lawsuits will have gone by the wayside.